translation of the Psalms. And probably after Psalm 23, this is probably the psalm that most people recognize some portion of. Well, at least that first verse. You've heard it somewhere before on someone else's lips. It's the cry. It's the cry that comes from Jesus when he's on the cross. And he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? If we listen to Jesus' words on the cross without knowing that they are Psalm 22, we look upon the event of the cross in a very different way. If we only see those words and have no understanding of Jesus' Jewish heritage and the role of the Psalms in his life, it is hard to imagine that anything that would happen afterwards could be possible. For if we only hear that one line and do not understand that it is in fact part of a greater prayer, we can look at the events of Good Friday and believe that Jesus had lost his faith in that moment. And how terrible the story of Easter would be if that is what had happened. The story of Easter can only be the story of Easter, the story that offers us all possibilities. The story that offers us our salvation, the story that offers us a God who loves us and an understanding of a God who loves us beyond all measure. That is only possible if we understand that when Jesus is hanging on the cross and he calls out these lines, he is actually quoting the psalm and not simply calling in despair. I would say for myself that has always been one of those moments, though that line had always bothered me. I was raised, as much as I was raised in any tradition in the church, I was raised with a bit of an understanding that really the life of the Old Testament, the life of the Hebrew Scriptures, the life of the Scriptures that were integral to Jesus' own personal faith, didn't really have an awful lot to do with anything that happened after his birth. No one had ever really sat me down and explained that even though we sang the Psalms in church as prayers and sang them as celebration, that there was actually a connection through Jesus himself between these ancient prayers that we were singing and praying and his life. I really was raised in a kind of a sense of the church that Jesus' Jewishness was something we didn't talk about. It was kind of like the dirty secret. And yet, he was a deeply Jewish man. He was deeply faithful in his Judaism. And when he is on the cross and he's hanging there, he offers one last prayer to God. It's not a cry of despair he offers, but rather a cry of hope. When I was studying at Vancouver School of Theology doing my master's, I had the absolute joy and pleasure, and probably, it was probably the most outstanding part of my program there. I had the joy of actually studying with a rabbi. And Robert brought into our experience of the ancient texts, particularly the ancient Hebrew texts, a different understanding of how they connected to life than we were experiencing under our more traditional Christian teaching that we were experiencing in school. And Robert brought this depth of experience into our learning that I've just cherished and loved ever since. And I remember one of the things he actually got to teach us was the Gospel of Matthew. Right? So Robert was teaching the Gospel of Matthew. We were at one point in the class doing the Easter story from Matthew, and we were talking about the 7 last things that Jesus says on the cross. And we were wrestling with this text of, my God, why have you forsaken me, as part of this wider study of Matthew's understanding of the crucifixion. And so we were kind of bringing all of the crucifixion experiences together and comparing them with Matthew. And the question was asked, why does Jesus cry in despair from the cross? And Rabbi Dom Robert says to us, he's not crying in despair, he's praying to God. And we said, well, isn't this the great cry of despair, of kind of like a give up God? Like, why have you abandoned me in this time and place? And Robert says, have you ever read Psalm 22? It's always embarrassing when the teacher asks you a question where you have to say no. And it's even more embarrassing when there's 37 supposed ministers in training who admit that there's a piece of scripture we haven't read. It's bad enough. And we did. We kind of owned up. I don't think there was really anybody in the class who kind of said, oh, yeah. I don't think there was even a keener. I don't think we had a keener in the class who said, I read all the Psalms and I go, well, there was no one. There was just like a deathly quiet. Crickets were singing outside the window. We could hear them. There's just silence. And Robert says, okay, let's open up to Psalm 22. We have to read the words that Jesus cries from the cross. We get into reading Psalm 22. This beautiful psalm of lament. This beautiful psalm that takes us and allows us to go deep into the sorrow and despair of our own lives and the lives of our world. This beautiful psalm that gives us language when we're struggling for language. That's always the beauty of all of the psalms. When people come to me and say, I don't have the language to speak to God about something, I've said, there's a psalm about that. I know there is. Because there's a psalm about pretty much every experience of the human being. And Psalm 22 is no exception. How many of us in life have sat in a place, whether it's a hospital bed side or whether it's in an empty house or on a park bench or in an office when that word has come through? How many times have we sat and asked, God, where are you? Where have you gone? Why aren't you sitting here fixing this for me? We understand that despair of that first few words of the psalm. My God, why have you forsaken me? We all have been in that moment. And if we aren't able to admit it, maybe it's because we're actually in that moment right now, where we're struggling with the despair of life and wondering, where is God? Where has God disappeared to? And the psalmist takes us through this beautiful emotional journey in this Psalm of Lament, and names how we feel in that terrible place. We feel less than human. We feel like a worm. We feel despair and loss, almost to the point where it feels, as the psalmist says, the bulls of Bashan and the wolves and the dogs are snapping at us and roaring at us and daring to tear at our flesh. We can be in that space with the psalmist. The psalmist can name our despair and our hurt. The psalmist names for us the hurt we feel when we feel we have been most brought to our knees. The psalmist gives us the language we need to speak to God about those times in our lives when we have felt like that. Rather than actually saying that God has left us, the psalmist helps us to give language to the feelings that we need to express to God when we can no longer speak for ourselves. And then the psalmist starts to turn it around. But before he turns it around, there's one line that also catches my attention. It actually reminds me of a character from a story or book. And as I'm reading about this psalmist who's in despair and is aching for God, who's aching for healing, there's a piece that just grabs my attention that takes me to another place in the psalm, and it's the piece about casting lots for the clothing. We know that piece too from the story of the crucifixion. In the crucifixion, we have that moment where the soldiers are casting lots for his robe. The fulfillment of prophecy that they would cast lots and share his clothing. I was thinking about this in the terms of who I am as a person. When I'm in that place of despair and loss, are those around me casting lots for my clothing? Or are they there to be with me in support and love? What is the measure of my life? The psalmist is asking, is it a place where I mean something because I have been meaningful? Or have I been the human being that they are casting lots for my very clothing? What has been my measure as a person? I was reminded as I was reading that line the other day of the movie version of the story of A Christmas Carol. There's a moment in the movie where Scrooge has died. He's having the three ghosts have come and they're doing the Christmas future, and he's died. And the ghost takes him to the pawnbroker or the rag person, the person who buys the stuff that is left behind. And there's the undertaker and the housekeeper and the cleaning lady, and they've each got a little bag, or a large bag, of stuff that they've taken from Scrooge's home. And I'm struck always by the line in the movie where the pawnbroker says to them, "Won't anyone miss them? Aren't they going to chase you down for taking literally the bedclothes from the dead man's deathbed?" And I think it's the cleaning lady answers, "Who in this world would miss this man's and his stuff? Who would miss this man that his stuff would even matter? Who would miss this man?" The casting of lots for the clothes reminds me that I have to enter into the engagement of my life, regardless of where I am, regardless of the despair that may surround me. I have to engage in the meaning into my life that God has given me, so that my life means more than the value of the clothes that they will cast lots for on my deathbed. My life needs to mean more than the casting of lots. I wondered as I sat there, and I still continue to wonder, I wonder if that's actually where Jesus wanted to head in the prayer as he quoted the psalm from the cross. I wonder, as he's thinking about the psalm, as he's hanging there and he's watching them cast lots for his meager possessions, whether he's asking God, does my life mean only that, or did my life actually mean something, God? Did it mean more? Or is the value of my life measured by the casting of the lots? And then the psalmist takes us into the words of hope and promise. Just like Jesus would remember that psalm, would take him into the words of hope and promise as he hung there. The hope and promise that we look back to the generations that have gone before us, and we remember their faithfulness, and more importantly, we remember God's faithfulness to them, even when they have messed up to the ultimate level that they could possibly mess up. And we know when we read Scripture, people mess up a lot. And we remember God's faithfulness to them, that God has come back time and time again to renew the covenant, to renew the promise. And in that renewal, we are reminded that our lives mean more than the value of the casting of lots. Our lives mean so much more to God than the value of the casting of lots, than the value of what we leave behind. Our lives mean so much more. You mean so much more to God. You mean so much more to God than any possession can possibly mean. And you matter, and because you matter, God does not abandon us. God does not leave your side. Even when you feel like a worm and the hands of hell are nipping at your feet, you mean more to God. For you are the beloved children. You are wanted and adored and loved and needed by God. Thanks be to God.